early in January 2022. I received a call from Watty on behalf of Reverend Watty, indicating that he needed to talk with me. I did not hesitate and called him immediately. After exchanging pleasantries, he said to me that over the Christmas, he has been thinking. He's now 88 years of age, and though he was feeling fine, you never know what could happen. Then he said to me, and I quote, "Cuthbert, if I should die before you, I want you to do my eulogy. However, I am not going anywhere now." He then spoke about the colleagues he had had over the years and where I ranked among them. He then chatted about his ministry, the history of the MCC that he was writing, and what should happen if he was not able to complete it before he passed. He reiterated, "I am not going anyplace now." I indicated to him that I would try to fulfill his wishes. So here am I today with a try. In 1976, at a seminar at the St. Andrew's Theological College, San Fernando, Trinidad, I first met Reverend Watty. He was lecturing on the book of Jeremiah. This was my first exposure to theological education at that level. I was greatly mesmerized by the insight he brought to bear on the subject, the depth of his knowledge, and the conviction with which he spoke. However, after 3 or so sessions, he contracted a virus and could not complete the lectures. I felt cheated and yearned for the lectures to be completed. I did not have an opportunity to talk to him because he was infectious. My next encounter with Reverend Watty was in 1980 when I entered UTCWI as a student. He was the president of the college. During my 4 years at UTCWI, we only spoke a few times, mainly about one of the subjects I did with him, and my Caribbean study research paper, for which he was the second marker. However, through the years, I listened keenly to every sermon he preached on campus, attended the Providence Methodist Church whenever he was preaching, and never missed one of his classes at UTCWI. There was no doubt that he was my favorite teacher and preacher at UTCWI. I departed seminary in 1984 and was assigned to the Port of Spain Circuit, Trinidad. He visited Trinidad in December that year, and I was asked to pick him up at the airport and take him to Diego Martin. I was then transferred to Barbados at the January 1985 Synod, and Reverend Watty was assigned as Superintendent Minister to the San Fernando Circuit. Instead of going to Barbados, in May 1985, I was reassigned to the then San Fernando Circuit to work with Reverend Watty as his junior colleague. I had mixed feelings about this change and the prospect of working with my Reverend Watty, but I promised myself one thing: I would not allow the Superintendent Minister, my past lecturer, teacher, and president of the college where I studied, to treat me as a student. After 5 years of an excellent working relationship and colleagueship, I realized that he also made a similar commitment, that he would never treat me as a student. During our time together in South Caribbean, I started to get to know Reverend Watty as a person, not only as a teacher or scholar or colleague. A colleagueship and a friendship developed which lasted over 38 years. Throughout those 38 years, a month would seldom pass when we did not communicate with each other. I prepared this eulogy, drawing upon these experiences and the countless conversations we have had about family, politics, the church, Bible, theology, history, Caribbean civilization, spirituality, prayer, the future of MCCA, his close friends, and myriad other subjects. I also received input from his spouse, his children, his siblings. I experienced Reverend Watty as a strong, forceful, fearless individual, but also at his most vulnerable times, truly human. The Reverend William Wilberforce Watty was born on the 1st of December 1933 at Portsmouth, Dominica, to Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel and Margaret Watty. He was the 8th of 11 children who grew up in a devout Wesleyan Methodist home where the children were taught from an early age to care for one another, respect their elders, and the principles of Methodism. This family home was filled with laughter. Although his father was a strict disciplinarian who took a keen interest in the intellectual development of the children and required that they always use correct grammar in speech and writing, the senior Mr. Watty also inculcated in the children an appreciation and love of music. In the home, the Lord's Day started with morning devotions at which every member of the family was expected to be in attendance, and each person had to pray. The rest of the day was ordered by attendance at worship at 11 a.m. and Sunday school at 3 p.m. The day concluded in the home with hymn singing led by William with his sister Mabel on the organ. According to his siblings, William was like his father both in physical features and mannerism. They shared the search for excellence, sternness, and a stubborn streak. Their father, Nathaniel and William, had a close bond so much that whether it was to retrieve his misplaced pen, glasses, or penknife, to go to the post office or to polish his shoes, it was William that their father called to perform these tasks. William often accompanied his father to the rallies of the Workers' Association or to visit a friend, usually one who was at their last. When Albert Connor, a friend of William's father, was dying, William accompanied his father to visit his friend. At that meeting, he watched his father break down in sobs as he offered a parting prayer for his friend. Such visits occurred regularly over the years. He had a similar experience when they visited his friend's brother, George. During the singing of the hymn, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," William witnessed tears rolling down the cheeks of Brother Connor. Reverend Watty recalled that day he was exposed to a depth of spirituality which remained unforgettable and impacted him as a little boy. He wrote in his booklet, Mount Wallace, A Brief History of Methodism in Portsmouth, I quote, "That was for me and has remained a memorable experience. It took me to the heart of what religion is all about. It was a religion that ran deep. One could feel the deep emotion of people as in humble reverence they bow in worship and prayer, sang out in rousing hymns of praise, and when so moved, wept in tears of grief and sorrow." Unquote. Reverend Watty's relationship with his father resembles that of Samuel and Eli. His father was his mentor, counselor, teacher, spiritual leader, and guide. This role was severed only by the passing of his father, who intentionally nurtured him. His father remained his confidant, created an atmosphere in the home where the principles and practices of Methodism were taught, and Christianity worked itself out in love. Cradled in an intellectual environment, always requiring grammatical correctness and the encouragement of music appreciation, set the stage for William Watty to become a Methodist minister. In this calling, he became a deeply spiritual leader, an intellectual giant, a pastor and preacher par excellence. A man whose sphere of influence would expand from his home as a husband and father to the Caribbean region and beyond. Through his preaching, writing, lectures, indomitable spirit, and forceful presence, he positively influenced countless lives. As one of my colleagues said, and I quote, "They don't make them like him any longer. An intellect that is unmatched." Unquote. Another mutual friend posited, "He is one of a vanishing species." Reverend Watty would be the first to indicate that the vanishing species is that of his father, whose life was centered around the home, the church, and community. Nathaniel was Reverend Watty's Eli. As we talked over the years, Reverend Watty also pointed to other influences on his life and ministry, namely the pastor family that he boarded with when going to grammar school, the church community of Portsmouth, his Sunday school teachers, and an experience in church regarding a visit by the late Reverend Dr. Philip Potter. Reverend Potter preached or spoke at an event at which Reverend Watty was present, and a member of the audience whispered loud enough for others to hear, and I quote, "There will not be another like him from Dominica," unquote. Reverend Watty indicated that comment stirred something in his spirit and confirmed God's call to him to full-time ministry and set him on the trajectory to theological training and seminary. Reverend Watty spoke appreciatively about his years in theological seminary, his teachers, colleagues, and he acknowledged that he was a good student, but modestly pointed out that it was the late Reverend Martin Roberts who was the scholar, not him. Reverend Watty had a tremendous respect for Martin Roberts as a person, as an intellectual, and as a visionary, and ensured that I met Reverend Roberts. He also spoke admiringly about his good friend, batchmate, and roommate, Reverend Linley Rankin, with whom he visited on his last trip to Jamaica. He cherished and kept this friendship over the years. With Reverend Rankin, he was part of a small group that he often spoke about, whose colleagueship, friendship, counsel, and example meant much to him. Others included Johnny Gums, the late Donald Henry, Burchell Taylor, Clement Gale, and Claude Cadogan. He recounted that at one Leeward Islands District Conference, Johnny Gums argued for a certain position that he, Reverend Watty, did not agree with. I asked him, "What did you say to Johnny's argument?" He responded, "Nothing." I asked why. His response was, and I quote, "Because Johnny is a debater, and I could not win against Johnny in a debate, so I said nothing," unquote. He had a great admiration for the late Donald Henry, whom he indicated had a keen intellect. He shared that Donald Henry could construct the most logical sermon on the spot, and one would not believe that he had not written a word. He respected Burchell Taylor for his scholarship. He thought that Clement Gale was a very wise man and cherished his guidance and support when he served as president of UTCWI. He said, "Errol Wilshire was one of the best colleagues he ever worked with." He respected Keith Ray, who he considered as one of the Caribbean ministers who left the Caribbean but remained loyal to the region and the MCC. He had deep respect for his senior student at seminary, the late Reverend Patterson Dean. They both vied for the chairmanship of the South Caribbean District in 1987. Reverend Watty was elected convincingly on the first round of the ballot. In his response, he indicated that he did not vote for himself, but for Reverend Dean. That is the statue of the man whose life we celebrate. Reverend Watty was convinced that his life was ordained by God and thought that the things he encountered in life happened neither by luck or chance, but rather by providence. For example, his first appointment was to the British Virgin Islands, where he resided on one of the smaller islands. He related his concern about living as a bachelor since he could not help himself in the kitchen. However, his predecessor had a household helper who intended to go back to one of the other islands after the minister left. For some reason, she decided to stay and remain with Reverend Watty for his time on the island. He was delighted when she decided to remain and take care of the kitchen and other household chores. When he left the BVI, he went off to England for 2 years and then to Trinidad, where he met Sisney John, the love and partner of his life. Reverend Watty and Mrs. Watty tell two different versions of how they met. When he told the story of their meeting, he was always emotional, sentimental, and emphasized how he was captivated by her pleasantness and beauty from the moment he set his eyes on her. Reverend Watty married Sisney on August 15, 1964, after a courtship of 5 months. Their union produced 2 children, Nathalie and Lenore. Most people agree that William needed a Sisney to complement him in areas lacked, such as her culinary skills and her pleasant, joyful, and easygoing personality. She is in no short measure gave him the freedom and unwavering support to excel in the ways he did. She adored him, and he knew that. He related a story about their time at the Connectional Conference office, where she served as his executive assistant. He said to me that Sisney was always late for work. And when he could take it no longer, he wrote a memo to all staff members reminding them of the time they should be at work. But the irony is that it was Mrs. Watty who was usually late because she had to prepare his breakfast. So Reverend Watty got to office on time. Reverend and Mrs. Watty were inseparable. They traveled together. She was always there for her bill. In some regards, Reverend Watty could not do without Sisney. When he attended the then South Caribbean District Synod held in North Trinidad Circuit while he was residing in San Fernando, he stayed at Mrs. Watty's family home in Diego Martin by himself. He said the first morning he tried to boil an egg and failed. He called Sisney and asked her to take days off from work and come to Port of Spain. Of course, she went. Why? Bill needed Sisney. They spent 59 years, 1 month, and 2 days together. There were ups and downs, as with all marriages. They traveled extensively to Nigeria, Europe, North America, and the Caribbean, and finally resided in Dominica. She was overheard telling someone when asked how she was doing, and I quote, "My partner gone. We used to do everything and go everywhere together. I'm going to miss him." Reverend Watty spoke lovingly about his children, what they were doing, and how they were doing. They are also proud. He was also proud of his daughters. In the words of Natalie, and I quote, "I was so proud of him, all that he was and had accomplished. Daddy's girl is an understatement. His quirkiness, his intellect, his gift for finding just the right words to explain a concept, be it in a sermon, political or social commentary, his wit and sharp turn of phrase, love of philosophical discourse and cricket, lovely cricket. He was my North Star, my protector, my biggest advocate, and my toughest critic. He featured prominently in almost every major event, life event, my baptism, my confirmation, and my marriage. He was the first member of my immediate family to meet my husband. He said of Wilco, I like him. This only confirmed what I already knew. This was the one for me. I was comforted by the fact that in those last days, when I could not be there, Wilco was there to help care for him, unquote. Lenore writes of their relationship, and I quote, my first love, my biggest supporter, my silent encourager, the disciplinarian, my father. He wasn't just a Methodist minister. He was one of, if not the best. The teenage years were the tumultuous years. Two opinionated young ladies and a headstrong alpha male, not a good recipe. The pot reached its boiling point many times, but never boiled over. William Wilberforce Watty has been the most influential male figure in my life, one whom I argue with, who I would do anything for, who upset my soul many times, yet whom I loved unconditionally and immensely, and from whom I received the same in return. The one man who has never failed me. He was my cheerleader, my protector, my pride, my joy. He was my fighter for a worthy cause. He fought for his parishioners, his colleagues, his country, and his family. And to the very end, he went down fighting. He has left a void that no other can fill, and not even time will heal. Unquote. This love and support that he gave to his children was replicated in some ways to other children and young people, and reflected in his vision for the young people of the MCCA. I had a front row seat to witness Rev'd Watty as the lecturer, the pastor, the preacher, the colleague, and the friend. I listened to many accounts and stories which shape his life, thinking, and his ministry. As a lecturer teacher, he was a favorite for many of the UTC students and those from other schools. As his students, we have our own stories to tell as to why he was the favorite and our rabbi. During classes, he would go to the podium, open his lecture notebook, moved away from the podium and the notes, and then lectured for 50 to 60 minutes, non-stop and without even glancing at his script. He would then return to the podium, close the notebook, and walk out of the room, leaving many, if not all, the students in awe, amazement, and asking the question, what manner of man is this? One of the experiences that left an indelible mark on many of his students was the time he walked back to the podium after mind-boggling 55 minutes of lecture, collected his notes and said, and I quote, "You will not find this in any text." He departed. The lesson was original thought. That's why for many of his students, he was the rabbi, a great teacher. There was a marked difference between Rev'd Watty, the preacher at UTCWI, and Rev'd Watty, the preacher in the circuit. In seminary, he was provocative, controversial, some may say liberal, others may even say radical in thought. There was no subject that he was afraid to touch, whether social, political, or otherwise. However, in the circuit, he was evangelical, pastoral, but certainly more empathetic and emphatic. Not surprisingly, the discipline of visiting the second shorty members week after week can bring pastors to reality. He often spoke about his experience of visiting the second shut-in and its impact on his life and ministry. Little did I know then that these visits brought back memories of his visit as a boy with his father to the dying. The best description of his preaching comes from the response of those who heard him. I recall him preaching in the open air in San Fernando on near and yet far from the kingdom, and on repentance to the point that the word challenged, convicted, and maybe even frightened his hearers. Then there was the 5 covenant services he preached in Kingstown, St. Vincent, between 1993 and 1997 when he was connectional president during my time as superintendent of the Kingstown Chatterby Circuit. The services each year were broadcast on national radio and television. The chapel was packed at 4 p.m. with almost 1,000 worshippers as he expounded the scripture on subjects such as watch your steps, bamboo Christians, my times are in your hands. And for me, the greatest sermon he's preached was at my ordination in the Kingstone Chapel in 1987, Magnify Your Ministry. Reverend Watty was fearless. He was not afraid to speak his mind, preach or write on any subject, no matter how controversial. Some years ago, he publicly said in Trinidad that apartheid could take place there. He was heavily criticized, but the reaction did not trouble him. He went to the Bahamas at a time of crisis, installed Reverend Ken Huggins as chairman of the district amidst protests, threat, demonstration, and confusion around the chapel where the ceremony was taking place. When the people of Antigua marched to the residence of the Archbishop of the Anglican Church, it was Reverend Watty he called to help and who went to his rescue. He wrote newspaper articles on the eve of election in Dominica without fear of criticism or reprisal. The worst thing one could do was to respond to his articles, because for him, the pen is mightier than the sword. He was fearless in speech, in preaching, in writing, and in his action. He did not fear death. He told one colleague that an airplane is a death trap. Each time he boarded an aircraft, he knew it could be his last. For him, death was a part of our reality. And it would happen at some time and in some way and at some place. However, he would be the first to tell you that he feared God more than death. Because he feared God, he had no fear of anyone or anything or even death. He was a man of his word. Reverend Watty was not one to give you a commitment that he could not fulfill. And if he did not fulfill his commitment as promised, he would have a good reason. In my own experience with him over the years, he always kept his word. Reverend Watty had a special love for and paid attention to the children and young people in the church. The same love and interest in the holistic development of his own children was reflected in his ministry for the children of the church. He believed that the children and young people were not the future church, but the church of today. He demonstrated this conviction every time he celebrated the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. He concluded it with an invitation for the children and young people to come forward for the blessing, mindful of the words of Jesus, "Suffer the children to come unto me, and if you do not become like children, you cannot enter the kingdom of God." No wonder that under his presidency, the decision was taken to offer the sacrament to children at 6.5 years and to delay confirmation for a later age. In fact, if Reverend Watty had his own way, he would have made the sacrament available to all children from as young as possible, in keeping with their eligibility for holy baptism. His daughter writes about her father something that could also come from children in the church. I quote, "He always made time for us. When we needed him, everything else was secondary." Reverend Watty could easily have said the same about his own father and mother. His interest in the development of children and young people And their place in the Methodist Church led to his support of the first youth encuentro when he was president of the Connection Conference of the MCC. His vision was not for an encuentro every 4 years, but for another encounter that young people would experience once as they were about to transition into young adulthood. His comment on the movie, The Passion of Christ, as related by Natalie, his daughter, says it all. I quote, "Any story of Christ that children could not see must be fundamentally wrong." There was no guile in him. After the most emotionally charged meetings in the circuit in which he was the superintendent, or at the South Caribbean District Synod, he laughed and chatted with those who challenged him in the meeting. In fact, he was at his best when challenged in a meeting. After the meeting, he never spoke a word of recrimination or said anything uncharitable about his parishioners. I remember one lady saying in our presence that her kind of ministers are no longer around. Reverend Watty looked at her and smiled, a kind of smile that said, "Poor you." He never said anything about that comment thereafter. When we worked together in San Fernando, on one occasion he tried the big stick approach in our relationship. In reaction, I just stayed away from the office for a couple of weeks. He got the message, summoned me to a staff meeting. What was on the agenda? Nothing. He just wanted to reassure me of his colleagueship. He never tried that approach again. He told one of our colleagues, "Cuthbert is a good colleague, but when you get him mad, he just stays away." He got the message. There was no guile in him. Not even when he wrote those stern letters, used the pen as a sword, there was no guile. He was concerned about the MCCA and had a deep longing to see the church realize its full potential. Some years ago, he was asked about his vision for the MCC. He expressed concern about the financial viability of the MCC, the leadership and capacity to build a vibrant 21st century church, and the spirituality of its leaders along with that of the church in general. Like John Wesley, he had no fear about the existence of Methodism, but felt that it could exist only as a dead set. He said to me in January 2022, "Cuthbert, I am writing a history of the MCC. I hope to complete it. However, if I do not complete it, I will leave instructions as to what you should do." Unfortunately, when I spoke to Lenore after his passing, it was on his computer, unfinished. In order to get a glimpse as to who this man is, we cannot start with his dynamic preaching, his intellectual giftedness, his eloquence, his prolific writings. We need to start with an understanding of the relationship between Reverend Watty and his father, the dynamics of the home in which he grew up, his nurture at the Methodist Church here in Portsmouth, and most significantly, his relationship with his Heavenly Father. He practiced a strong and meaningful prayer life that was the source of his eloquence power, erudition. No wonder that one of his favorite hymns was Sweet Hour of Prayer. His spirituality was cradled in the home, nurtured in boarding school, in boarding and the Mount Wallis Church, mentored by his father, reinforced by experiences. One day, as he was walking away from and refused to return when his mother asked him to do so, he said that after a while his mother stopped calling. Soon after, he stomped his toe, and with that returned home immediately for his mother to attend to the toe. He asked his mother why she had stopped calling him. She related him that his father said to her, and I quote, "Stop calling him because as soon as he stomps his toe, he will return home." So said, so done. Words are insufficient to capture the measure of this man. These are recollections that we will cherish in our memories, part of the legacy that he leaves behind that should shape the church and our lives. So, to some, he's a fine teacher, lecturer, preacher, brilliant orator, writer, mentor, president, bishop, and for some of us, he is our spiritual leader, our mentor, our rabbi. Rabbi, rest in peace.